to the dinner party example, like if you're at a restaurant or something and there's like 5 of you sitting around having a conversation, and then suddenly your 2 of your friends walk in and you're like, oh, come and join us. If you have 6 or 7 people in a conversation, either the conversation will split in half, or some people will just disengage. And that's not a random thing. That's a property of our cognitive capacity. Like 5 people can mutually hold shared context. They can all kind of simulate each other's state of mind simultaneously. We can become like a hive mind with 5, but with 6 or 7, it's too complicated. You can't kind of keep up with that. And so either, the conversation splits in twos, either some people like they just tune out and they stop paying attention, or you could, if you're in like a meeting, you might have a facilitator or a whiteboard or some kind of structure that helps us pay attention and kind of like manages people's time. So you can obviously have a useful conversation with more than 5 people, but you need a bunch of extra structure to make it happen.
Hello, I'm Shelley Keredwen, and this is Reconnect. And I'm here today with Richard Bartlett. And Richard is someone who's been on my radar for the last 2 years, since I really started delving into the idea of community. And Richard, I found on Twitter. Twitter isn't a channel that I use a great deal, but it seems like every time I go on there, there's a post from you. And it is all about community, bringing people together. And really, that's why you stayed on my radar for so long. I started delving into what you're into, and my curiosity is sparked more and more. So I would love to say hello, welcome, and I'll give you the floor to tell us a little bit about who is Richard.
Thanks for having me. Who is Richard? It's a philosophical question to start with. Where is it useful to launch? I mean, probably at the moment, I've noticed that as I tell my story over the years, it kind of changes, like what chapters I want to emphasize change. And like what's present with me at the moment is I grew up in this very tight-knit, super religious Christian community. And when I was about sort of like 20 or so, left, right? So I have this like really intensely kind of quite old-fashioned fundamentalist Christian community, and then I kind of break out of that and go to the big city. This is in New Zealand, where I'm from, and do like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing. The kind of like rebellion against the old-fashioned thing. Find myself quite lonely, disconnected, and a bit lost, like kind of somewhat having fun with the rock and roll, but also being quite lost and nihilistic. And then when are we? 2011 is the start of the Occupy movement, and that obviously started in Wall Street, but it reached all the way down to New Zealand. And so like I got involved in that, and that was a big kind of aha moment. Like, these people are doing something together, like they're doing something in a cooperative, non-hierarchical way. There's like a real sense of peer-to-peer connection. So that was a sort of spark of it, maybe like a new kind of community that wasn't so dogmatic or like strictly organized as the one that I grew up in. From there, I went off and built some technology. It's a bit boring to me now. I've kind of like left the software.
Different version of you.
Yeah. It's like, I mean, I don't know, software is interesting for some people, but I've kind of I think I put enough time into it that I got a bit bored. And then so most of the story is all in New Zealand, but then in 2018, I think it was, my wife Nati and I decided that like New Zealand was too small, too disconnected, maybe too quiet, and we wanted to travel. And so now we live in Europe. We've been traveling around a lot, different parts of the world. And the transition out of New Zealand and into the wider world kind of came with it. This question of community, like who do I want to be spending time with? What even do I need? Like, what do I need to have a satisfying life? Like, can I have, I think a lot of us had this experiment during the pandemic, right? Like, can I have a satisfying social life all through Zoom and like social media platforms? Personally, no, I can't. Maybe some people can. But I've been trying to understand, like, what do I need to really feel like I'm thriving on the community side of things? And my answer to that question essentially has been to develop, I guess that's like a community building framework called micro solidarity. And that is a map that I've used for my own community building work, but also a bunch of other communities have picked it up, and now it's a network of community organizers that are all supporting each other and learning from each other. So that's really satisfying. Yeah, not just for my own needs of like having some belonging and having some collaboration and having some sense of shared purpose and like cool people around me, but also seeing the other organizers out there and being able to learn along with them. So that's a big part of my focus these days. And yeah, I've just come from 2 weeks ago. We had what we called micro solidarity summer camp. So it was like 50 something people outside of Berlin. Yeah, a bunch of community organizers learning together. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. There's many more other things about who is Richard, but I think that's enough kind of like post-it notes to get the ball rolling.
I think there's two things there that I'd really love to delve into. One is the fact that the sunk costs you mentioned about kind of being into a technology project and you kind of getting over that and moving on. And I think for a lot of people in our careers, we kind of start doing something, we get kind of good at it, we get known for it. And for a lot of people, they don't step away, even if their calling is actually, I'm done with technology, I'm done with staring at a screen all day, because they just think, oh, well, this is just what I do. So what called you hard enough to go, no, I can step away from that?
I'm going to give you my honest answer, which is potentially a little philosophical, but hopefully it illustrates how I think. If I were to say, like, if I were to use this phrase, like the inner compass, like that you have some kind of inner compass that tells you which direction to point. Do you know what I'm talking about?
100%.
Right. So in my current worldview, I like to imagine that I'm like the individual me is a part of a superorganism, potentially part of multiple superorganisms, that like that I'm an organ, or I'm a limb in this larger creature and a higher being of some kind. And there's a way of living life where I kind of ignore the superorganism, as in I ignore anyone apart from myself, and I just like kind of knuckle down and like have my own desires and pursue the thing that I care about. But then there's this other way which is more receptive, that's more curious about a bigger, to be part of a bigger thing. And yeah, I've been trying to cultivate that sense of receptivity. And when I listen, yeah, it's so hard to describe, you know, because it's this like personal inner process which doesn't actually fit much into words.
You are.
Right. Great.
Paint a picture.
Great. Yeah, I think there's a way to kind of listen to what am I being called to, and that when I align my action with that compass or with that call, then I get positive feedback. You know, like some of the positive feedback is just, oh, I'm doing good work and people like it and they say, good job, Rich. But also it's more than that. It's like that the work is effortless. In fact, it's kind of like negative effort that I get more energy from doing it than, you know, that I finish feeling like. I think where I was getting to was basically that I've been over the last, well, for a long, I mean, probably for most of my life, but it's been noticeable, especially in the last decade, that I've been navigating, trying to listen for this signal, for this thing that's not quite me, that I've got a role to play in, but it's not exactly me. It's like my participation in a larger system. I've been listening to that that signal, and yeah, the more that I steer my life towards it, the more satisfaction and meaning I have. So I just keep doing that. And it's kind of taught me that risks are they're no problem, you know. It's like things work out. Things work out in the end. So like, for example, right now I'm calling you from my motorhome. In February of this year, my wife and I decided we were sick of living in an apartment. We bought a motorhome. We've never done that before. We've never even been in a motorhome before, but we decided we're going to live in a motorhome. So now we live on the road and we drive around and, you know, do our work. And it's kind of a risky move, but I'm held by that sense of confidence that things kind of work out. And so, yeah, I'm not too worried about the sunk cost or like what we've been doing up until now. I feel like quite a lot of freedom.
And I was just picking up the freedom feeling there with you, like how liberating that must feel to, it's kind of like people that like going on cruises. I like the idea of having a different scenery every day, but being constrained to the same people in close confinement kind of terrifies me.
Yeah, that's not for me. Freedom's like really high on my list of values, I would say.
And something else that you mentioned there was aligned action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I another way to think about it is just that I want to die happy. And for me, that doesn't mean like having a bunch of objects around me. It means having put my energy into something purposeful, and yeah, to have a sense of satisfaction, a sense of dignity, a sense of like meaning. That's what I've been optimizing for.
Something I like to think of is imagining coming to the end of our life when we're 98 years old, sleeping in our beds, and watching the movie of our lives. Is it a movie that we want to sit and watch before we pass? And creating a movie where we are the protagonist and the casting director having an intentional life is something that I'm down with.
Yeah, I'm down with that too.
Yes. Cool. So let's dive into micro solidarity. I know there's a certain number of scales in this system. Is that something you'll be willing to kind of talk us through the different scales of this?
Yeah. It's kind of abstract, I guess, in a way, to just talk about scales, but hopefully I can illustrate like why that's important. One of the reasons that I start from scale is because in my community organizing work over the last decade and working with other people, one of the problems that I think keeps tripping people up is a lack of scale sensitivity. And so that means like people don't have a really sharp idea about what different group sizes are good for. So for example, you know, some of my friends are into Burning Man. I've never been, but I kind of have a picture in my mind a little bit about these kind of transformative festivals. And a festival is always, you know, hundreds or thousands of people, and it's quite common for people to go to a festival or something like that and have this quite profound experience of like, wow, I feel belonging maybe for the first time, or I really feel like I've come home. And it's a lovely feeling. But the problem is like, if it's you and 50,000 people, and you're like having this powerful moment, 2 weeks later when you're back at home, and you've had an argument with your boss, or like your dog got run over, those 50,000 people are not there for you. Like they don't actually care about you. Like they haven't had a chance to get to know you. At that scale, you're anonymous, and so like you can't. While you do have this feeling of belonging, like I'm part of the tribe, it doesn't actually translate into any like material solidarity. And that's like one example of what I mean by a lack of scale literacy or a lack of scale sensitivity, that people kind of like, oh, I've got this good experience, and then they might assume that that's their belonging needs met, like I'm part of this big festival community, where actually it's like, if you want to have reliable, dependable support, like material support or emotional support in your life, you're going to have to be a committed member of much smaller groups where they can actually see who you are, and they can notice when you're not there, and so on. So that's like one of several reasons about why there's this focus on scale. And I usually there's kind of like different steps and different sizes up and down this ladder. So often I would start from the bottom end, not because this is the right place to focus, but just as it's the right way to explain it. At the bottom end, you have an individual person, and I found it really, really useful for myself to use this metaphor of a person being a kind of a group. And there are like different therapeutic modalities and psychological modalities that use this. The one that I'm most familiar with is internal family systems, but there's lots of them now that kind of treat your different aspects of your personality as kind of like parts, or as like almost like sub people in a way. So like right now there's a part of me who's a little bit anxious about being on record, you know, but then there's another part of me who's like completely relaxed because I'm in my motorhome and I've had a good day. And so like there's these different parts, and it's sometimes useful to use that parts language, because the parts of me have relationship between each other. So like the way that I treat my anxious parts is gonna be, there's gonna be some parallel between how I treat my anxious parts and how I treat your anxious parts. So like if you're anxious, I might be all like, oh, ooh, you know, keep me away. I don't want to deal with that. I can't accept that. Because I can't accept my own anxiety. So I found this like language of treating the self as a group to be really fruitful for my own understanding of myself and for others, and like how I relate to others. So that's the first scale. Like the first group is only one person, but it's like, it's still a multiplicity. And
Like
then
treating yourself like you would treat a good friend. Is that kind of it?
exactly. And when you say like treating yourself, that immediately, like, how can you treat yourself as something? You're immediately, like, in your imagination, you're kind of becoming two people in a way. Like
Yeah.
there's the one who's in distress and then the one who's caring for them. So there's already like an internal relationship.
Abraham Hicks said that we are always designed to be our own significant other. And once we realize that, we are always full, we are always complete, and we don't need to be dependent on anyone or anything else.
Yeah, nice. Another dimension of this maybe is like, if you're having a bad time and you experience some fear, an emotion like fear can like fill up your entire awareness and become panic and just become overwhelming. But if you can see the space around the fear, like if you can see like, there's a part of me that's fearful, but actually there's this other part that's like quite sober or calculating or, you know, available for other, you know, like just has more creativity or something. Once you can start to decouple a little bit or see some space around, okay, yeah, there's fear and there's other stuff, at least for me, and I think for others as well, like that the fear becomes a lot more manageable when it's not filling up your entire space, but it's just saying, okay, there's parts of me that are fearful, but there's other parts that are like, yeah, more confident or more courageous. So that's just been a really helpful lens for me. And I mentioned internal family systems. I don't really like, for me, it's important not to be dogmatic about any of these theories, but just to say this is a lens that's been helpful. So then the next, so you go up from the one person, then up to the scale of two people, and I call that a dyad. And I think what's useful about the dyad is as soon as you have another person, you kind of have this opportunity for power dynamics to start playing out. So like in this conversation, my expectation is that you're the host and I'm the guest. And that sort of sets some, you get to set the direction of where we go, but then also I get to do most of the talking. You know, there's kind of like there's some roles that get played out. And it's the same, like if I was having a dinner party and you came over, then the roles are reversed. And there's these kind of expectations about what is included in that role definition. And the power dynamic stuff, I think, is kind of essential to any kind of group organizing or community organizing. You have to think about power, like it's going to come up. It inevitably comes up. And there's lots of different ways to come at this power question. Obviously, that's a very juicy topic. But the one that I've found the most fruitful in the last few years, the one that's like, yeah, that's actually been productive for me to keep returning to, is a lens from Brianne Eisler, who's a really awesome theorist that I love. And she talks about a spectrum of relationships from domination to partnership. And the domination mode is like, you know, one person basically has more power and they use it to threaten other people, to, you know, be in power over them, to like limit their freedoms, to force them to do stuff, or else there's going to be negative consequences if you don't comply with my instructions. You know, like this is the kind of coercive power that people associate with like a bad boss or something like that. And then on the other end, you have the partnership being, we're still different people, you know, like in the host and guest relationship, we're different. We've got different roles to play, but neither of us is trying to dominate the other, you know, like we're not trying to force each other. We're trying to find like a mutually satisfying arrangement here. And when Brianne Eisler described this framework for thinking about power, she's talking about between two people, but she's also talking about between two countries or like any kind of scale. And again, I found that
beneficial.
Yeah. And I want to emphasize the difference thing, you know, because there's some people that get it. How do I say this? You can be upset about inequality in power. And some people take that anger and turn it into a pursuit of pure equality where everyone's the same. And that to me is not partnership, you know, that's a kind of like conformity, where I'm like, no, we can be different. Like we've got different roles to play, we've got different strengths, everyone's got something to contribute. And it's not about different, it's not about trying to get everyone to be the same. It's actually like finding a way to enhance our differences and make them fit together in a harmonious way. So that's the scale of 2, and there's things that you can do with 2 that you can't do on your own, you know. Like a podcast is not very interesting if there's only one person on it. It's much better as a conversation. And then the next scale I call the crew. I was thinking about like the crew of a sailing ship, you know, like all hands on deck. For me, the crew is like, it can be quite productive. Generally, like size wise, I usually think it's like 3, 4, or 5 people. Some crews are a little bit larger, but 5's a good number. And the number's important because above 5 people, I mean, you can actually see this, like if you go back to the dinner party example, like if you're at a restaurant or something and there's like 5 of you sitting around having a conversation, and then suddenly 2 of your friends walk in and you're like, oh, come and join us. If you have 6 or 7 people in a conversation, either the conversation will split in half, or some people will just disengage. And that's not a random thing. That's a property of our cognitive capacity. Like 5 people can mutually hold shared context. They can all kind of simulate each other's state of mind simultaneously. We can become like a hive mind with 5, but with 6 or 7, it's too complicated. You can't kind of keep up with that. And so either, the conversation splits in 2s, either some people like they just tune out and they stop paying attention, or you could, if you're in like a meeting, you might have a facilitator or a whiteboard or some kind of structure that helps us pay attention and kind of like manages people's time. So you can obviously have a useful conversation with more than 5 people, but you need a bunch of extra structure to make it happen. So the thing about the group of 5 is like, it's about as big as you can go without needing any, I call them prosthetics, any like artificial structure. You can just do it completely organically, just relying on our like animal instincts. And you become this kind of, again, I use the word superorganism, like a group of 5 people is a superorganism of a particular species. And it's super powerful. It's really capable of doing a lot. And because you've got these different perspectives, it's got a huge amount of intelligence as well as capacity. So the crew scale for me is where most of the focus in a micro-solidarity community is. So like, if you're doing practical projects, or if you're trying to, I don't know, we use crews for how do you do governance? It's like as much as possible, we try and break things down into small groups and say, okay, you can be in charge of the branding decisions and we'll be in charge of the gardening or whatever. Instead of trying to get a whole massive community to all see things the same way and all agree in the same way, we just break it into chunks and say like, okay, we delegate this responsibility to you, and 5 or 4 people, 6 people, whatever, there's enough cognitive diversity to be able to make good decisions without needing to involve everyone.
Amazing. I love this so much. It's speaking to so much of my recent research, and it's just like, yes, this is it. So recently I came across Dunbar's number by researcher Robin Dunbar, and I've been delving into this, and it's like, this makes so much sense. Like we can, in his theory, we have the capacity for 150 people in our widest circles. So any more than that, we are not able to really keep connected, know who they are. And then that comes in, and 5 is his optimal number for close connections. And then it kind of stretches out to 15, and then 50, and then you're 150. So I'm loving this so much.
Dunbar is really good because he has described larger numbers as well, and it basically just goes on in that same pattern. So like 5, 15, 50, 150, 500, 1500, 5000, like it just keeps going. And his theory, I don't know, I haven't looked close enough at the primary research, but his theory is that you can actually see, like if you look at, for example, how is a population distributed around a country into like little hamlets and villages and towns and cities and so on, that you'll kind of start to see these different size populations that get, like that. Even just how do you what are the sort of jurisdiction bodies and your city council versus your state level thing or your national level thing, like that you'll start to see these different thresholds of groups of different size. And basically for me, I just think it's useful to train, if you're an organizer, it's useful to train yourself in this literacy of scales and understand that groups of different size are capable of different things and they're good for different things. And like a group of 15, maybe you can have a really satisfying consensus decision-making process, but a group of 500, like, just, it's not realistic. You can't do that. But then you can do things with 500 that you can't do with 15. And so it's like understanding that these are all different organisms and they need different treatment. I think, yeah, it's just something that many organizers, I feel like they've missed, and developing that sensitivity really helps.
Thank you. So I've had experience living a different way. So I spent 4 months at an eco village, living in community, to see how it feels to be in community. I thought this was the way that I wanted to live. My perspective has shifted on that now. And I've come across a few groups that are doing, like, I like the idea of like co-housing, where you've got a degree, you're kind of all putting your hand up to say, yes, I want to be part of a community, but you're not, the expectation is lower in terms of how many meals you're having per week and that kind of thing. I'd love to hear about your experiences of kind of living just outside of conventional society, and maybe your views on what you think is the way forward for yourself and perhaps even for humanity.
Yeah, I don't know what humanity's up to. I don't know if I've got opinions about that, but for myself, something that's very common in New Zealand, and not so common in other parts of the world, is just like, basically from the time that you leave home, you know, sort of around, it's kind of like you go to university, often that means you move towns, until maybe you'd get married and then like do the nuclear family thing. There might be like a 10-year gap there, and it's extremely common in New Zealand during that period that you'd be living in shared housing with like 6 to 10 adults. You know, that's like quite a common experience, and I found that really satisfying to live that way. And especially like that these shared houses, they don't come up in isolation. They're actually in neighborhoods, you know, and they're related to each other. So like this house maybe is has a slightly more political focus, and this one is more like sporty, and this one's more spiritual or something, but that they're all mutual friends, or like they've got friends in common, or they have parties and everyone's invited, or, you know, there's sort of this extended social fabric of shared houses where you can kind of come in one and get redirected to, actually you should be more in that one, you know, they could be a better fit.
In most New Zealand cities,
I think so, yeah. I mean, I spent most of my time in Wellington, and that it's really, really strong there, that kind of mentality. It is a university city, so that helps. But I think, yeah,
I know Tauranga up north, they have quite a few like that too there.
Right. And that's just I don't know, it's a very satisfying way to live. And when I've traveled into larger cities in other parts of the world, I haven't found my way into those networks. I'm not sure if they exist, but they're maybe hard to find as an outsider. But I find that really, really satisfying. And my shorthand for this is like neighborhoods, not communes. Like I think at least at this point in history, I think people want connection, they want collaboration, they want friendship, they want companionship. But piling a lot of people into one space and getting them to agree on things, and like have to go through some like kind of deep emotional process to decide whether or not we want to have a third dog that lives here, or like most people don't actually have the appetite to do that. And I think most people find that those kind of meetings quite tedious. Some of it, I'm quite into it. I'm a nerd about these things, and so I find it fascinating that, yeah, I'm having like such profound psychological insights about my opinion about whether we should have 2 or 3 dogs in the house. But most people, like I said, it's tedious. It's like,
as like the observer, like watching your own thoughts play out.
yeah, that's fun, but I just don't think it's realistic for most people. And even without that, like people that have spent a lot of time just with less, with fewer people around, with like less expectation of collaboration, they're often not very well equipped for it. Even if they think it would be nice in theory, like it requires a level of clarity in your communication. It requires a lot of self-awareness about your emotional state, and like how do you regulate your emotions, especially when things are getting difficult. It requires a bunch of skills around decision making and around conflict. Like there's a effective community living, like if you're going to put a whole bunch of people into one space, yeah, it just comes with a bunch of skills that are required and not necessarily taught anywhere. So that adds to the struggle of it, that it can be quite painful, and people can be quite disillusioned after they try it for a while and go like, oh, this is not for me. Personally, I think my dream, for at least, I mean, at the moment we're traveling, like we're nomads, and so that's a weird temporary life where most days of the week it's me and my wife and nobody else, and all of my socializing is happening digitally, which is happening a lot. So I'm not alone, that's for sure. I'm not lonely. But then I have these like we just came from summer camp, so it was like a week-long gathering, which was very intensive, very intensive socializing process. And so like my life has these like periods of intensity and then more space for reflection and introspection and so on. But I think the sort of next stage after being nomads would be a nice big piece of land, maybe 3 or 4 families on it, a retreat center that's like hosting events periodically. But yeah, finding that balance between privacy and collaboration, you know, like having our own set apart spaces where it's easy to just say, I don't want to deal with anyone today. It's pretty essential, but not doing it on our own. Like I think it's more interesting to do it with like I say, 3 or 4 families, like pretty small, but enough that you can just take on projects that are much harder to take on as one family. But what about you? Tell me more about your experience of it.
Yeah, so one thing that I wanted to pick up was the term nomad. So when I was at the eco village, and we're obviously all sharing about ourselves, so I'm someone that's lived in 10 different places around the world. I've spent a month or more in 4 or 5 other places. Like I'm a traveler, and my father emigrated to New Zealand when I was 11. So from the age of 12, I was traveling long haul just with my sister and I. So I guess that just opened our eyes from an early age of everything's possible. And we have a great relationship with my dad, and that continued. So we just really embraced the opportunities that were presented to us as kids, and that has translated into my grown-up life. But when I kind of told a bit of my story at the eco village, and someone said, oh, you're a nomad, like that didn't sit comfortably with me. And I've been in Canada, I think by that point, I've been in Canada for just over a year. So essentially I was a nomad, but for some reason, I think I'm starting to accept the term more readily now. But like in my marketing message, like people said, oh, use nomad. And I'm like, well, I don't know, because it didn't necessarily sit comfortably with me, but it rolled off your tongue really easily.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's been a process as well. When I sort of realized that nomad doesn't mean traveler, those are different things. Like I think a nomad has a role to play, like it's kind of like being a plumber. Like there's a specific job for a nomad, and that involves like moving from place to place and sharing stories and sort of like doing something that you can only do after you've been in 50 different places, you know, like kind of like seeing the things that they all have in common, and sharing inspiring stories from one place to the next, and making introductions and connections, and like, yeah, figuring out what is the role to play that only someone who's traveled a lot can play. Like that, once I sort of got that self-image, I think it became a lot more satisfying, and like, yeah, this is a job to
do. I like that. And yeah, essentially, I definitely do want to put some roots down somewhere. This is a pretty spectacular spot that I'm in right now on Vancouver Island. It's not an easy place to get into. It's quite a cliquey scene here. So 2 years into our Canadian adventure, it feels like we are just kind of really getting into it. So it takes time wherever you go. But I guess essentially for me, like I'm really trying to build my hybrid intentional community, because like for me, lockdown, I was living in Wales at the time. Most of my friends in the family are in England or elsewhere around the world. And, you know, like you, I've traveled a lot. I've got a lot of people in my, you know, it's more than 150, my wider orbit. But during lockdown, it certainly didn't feel like they were in my life. I felt lonely. So I'm like, I'm not going to accept that could happen again, or I could feel that way again. So I'm like, how can I hedge my sanity against that occurring? So I'm trying to build a hybrid intentional community, because I want people physically here, but there's also people in my wider network that I want to feel in my life. And I think the research that I'm doing, like the Dunbar's number and speaking to you and other people that I'm speaking to, it is thinking about it needs to be smaller. And all of our social networks are too big. So we need to kind of do these regular digital events with our wider groups to then feel into who is resonating with the stage of life that we are at right now. Because people are going to be coming in and out of our life throughout our whole life. And that's okay. But yeah, really trying to define who those people are within those inner circles, whether they are in person or online, and then really working on having some regularity with them to keep that alive. Because something that came to me this week through a parking fine, which I didn't pay the London low emission fee the other day. So I got a big parking fine. And I'm like, what learning can I take away from this? So my learning was action has consequences, but so does inaction have consequences when it comes to friendship.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually in an environmental zone right now, and I'm hoping I'm not going to get a ticket.
Learn from my mistake.
You know what comes to mind for me is like I mentioned my background with religion. I found it really useful just recently to think about, like, if you can look at religion and separate what religion says from what it does. So like the Christian religion has a whole bunch of stuff about God and about the afterlife and about morals and about sin. But if you just scrap all of that out, just ignore all that completely and just say, what does it do? And when it's going well, at least like in my childhood, what it did was like, there's a building and people go there every week. And at least in our church, what happened was like, and it was basically 150 more or less, like kind of sometimes 100, sometimes 200, but in that ballpark. All these families would come, they'd go twice a day on a Sunday. And the feature of doing it twice is that like you come in the morning, you have your morning service, and then like a bunch of kids from one family will go to another family for lunch, or else the 2 or 3 families will get together. There's this kind of like blending process that happens, this kind of informal blending, and then they get together again in the afternoon for another service, and so then the kids can go home, or like, you know, you've got that. So you've got this like this weekly rhythm where people have got the thing that they do every week. They're singing together. I think that's another essential like bonding process. They've all decided that they're going to give some fraction of their income, partly to pay the guy at the front of the room who's telling them how to be a good person, but partly also to fund like an informal network of solidarity where, like, for example, if someone loses their job, maybe the church will cover their rent for a couple of months, or like even without the money side of things, like if someone has a baby, then all the other families are going to cook casseroles and send them frozen pies and things like that, you know, like this kind of informal caretaking thing that's happening. And then you have, you know, like there's the youth group and the Bible group and all these like little clubs and things that are happening. That model, when you just look at what it does and you ignore everything that it says, to me, I suspect that that's what is kind of necessary for most people to really feel at their best, is to be like plugged into something like that, which has this dependable rhythm of encountering each other. That's happening at a local scale. It's happening where like you're, you know, like how I'm, like I said, I'm married. I'm not in the dating game, but a lot of my friends are in the dating game and they hate it. You know, it sounds like it's really unpleasant. Whereas if you're in like a network of churches and you have like what we had when I was a kid, once a year you'd have this like big annual gathering where people from all the other churches would get together, and it's like mostly young people, and it's like basically a big dating adventure, like that's kind of what it's designed for. That to me is so much more pleasant than trying to like swipe on an app. So yeah, I think maybe I'm just coming out as a very conservative person, but I think people need something like church in their life to help meet those needs for belonging and support. Even when you ignore like all the purpose side of things, just the like having friends.
And the regularity, that ritual of every Sunday or one day. So I don't know if you're familiar with Time for Tribe. Have you come across them yet? So they're based in Seattle, and it's run by this, I'm not sure if they're married, but this partnership, and I guess they're in their 60s. They've lived at various intentional communities through their lives, realized what works well, what doesn't work well, and they've come to realize that they want to live in their own space, but they still want that sense of community. So they came up with Time for Tribe. They created community values, and then invite people in who resonate with those values, who live, they say, which I really like, bicycle distance apart. So accessible. They get together every Friday, and they'll get together in circle. I think there's about 20 to 22 people in that. So it's kind of outside of the numbers that we've been speaking about, but maybe not everybody attends everything, but that's the only commitment every Friday night. And, if there's birthdays or celebrations in between, they'd certainly be inviting one another. But the only expectation is that once a week thing. And what I love about Time for Tribe is their initiation ceremony. Every new recruit or new member comes up with their own initiation. So it's really unique and really memorable to everybody else. And then there's no pressure on the organizers. And they've said, like, even though they started it, the idea is that it becomes a self-managing team. So once it's then established, they then sit back and they are just the same as everybody else. And, if people leave and they want to invite new replacements in, that's not just their decision, it's the group decision, consensus.
Yeah, cool. I mean, that the focus on that regular rhythm to me has been, that's the other half. So I talked a lot about the scale. The other half is the rhythm, and like that to me is like kind of the most essential ingredient of like forming collective identity, is that like the group meets on a regular rhythm, which is, again, it sounds like kind of mundane and basic, but when it comes to like when I most need help, like that's the moment where I'm least able to ask for help. So like if there's not a rhythm, if there's not some like pre-existing structure, and I'm having a hard time in my life, I'm just going to like drift off and be isolated. But if there's a thing that I do every week or every month, then I've got a lot of momentum to just keep doing that thing. And if I don't show up, then someone's going to reach out and be like, hey, you weren't there this week, what's up? So that's been that's a really, really solid and kind of countercultural. People don't want to put unnecessary constraints on you or something like that. But yeah, developing that dependability has had a huge payoff.
Something that's been coming through to me, and I'm just going to scat out loud with you because I'm curious to know what your thoughts on it, right? So because I've traveled around a lot, I actually found that in my 20s, I actually had really good relationships, because I'd often start dating someone and I'd be like, I knew that I was leaving in 6 months and I can just have a really nice relationship. We know there's an end in sight and then it's all good. We remain friends and all that kind of thing. I'm with someone, have children now, so that's kind of past. But this kind of having an end and then there being a beauty in what is, knowing that it's finite. Something that came through to me when I really started thinking about this was the number 22. And I was just, for some reason, just thinking what we create, people can stay in for up to 22 weeks. I've had a spiritual mentor for the last year and a half, and I was just really curious about this. And I mentioned to him, and he had an intentional community in Ontario decades ago. And he said that's really interesting, because when they would bring people in, people would either do a 1 or 2 week immersion, or they'd stay for 5 months. And that was like a natural cycle. And I'm like, that is pretty much, that's the 22 weeks. So I just wonder, has anything like that come to you before?
Yeah, I haven't got a ping on 22 exactly, but more that this thing of having an end, beginning with the end in mind, that's been really solid as well. So like I mentioned the rhythm, when it comes to like starting a new group, or like you're saying, inviting someone in to an existing thing, but they're a newcomer, I think it's many of the times, not all the times, but often it's really useful to invite someone in for a time limited. You're not saying, you know, until death do us part, you know, like that kind of endless commitment is like a really special thing. But most of the time I found it helpful to say, so for example, I'm actually toying with this idea right now. I want to be doing more writing, so I'm sort of thinking about, maybe I'll start a writing club and I'll invite 5 people and we'll meet once a week, and the invitation will be, let's do this 5 times, or, you know, some limited number of times, rather than let's pretend it's forever, when we all know it's not going to be forever. There's going to be some point where it stops anyway. So let's design a moment where we're going to stop and reflect, and we're going to say, like, how's it going? Was this a worthwhile use of our time? Do we want to keep going, but maybe we'll change something? Or do we want to say, no, I'm done, thank you? And you have like a graceful way to say, that's enough for me, you know, thanks for your time. Like a face-saving way to quit on something that's not super satisfying. I think like having that having that moment of pause, even if it's not an end of an end, but like a moment where it's okay to end, where it's kind of like naturally, like, this would be a good time to close, thank you very much. I think it saves a whole bunch of awkwardness, and like allows for the thing to stay fresh. And like you have an explicit moment where you can say, it's nearly there, but if we just change this and this, then I'd find it much more gratifying. Having that kind of pulse built into it, I think, makes a big impact.
I love that so much. And I come from a corporate environment where you would do, like, I used to be in the internal comms, so I'd be doing employee engagement, well-being, and we would do those engagement pulse checks. And it's like, why don't we do those in our personal relationships? What is serving you? Am I serving you? Like, what could I do better in this relationship? Imagine that, full transparency.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, Alana Irving, wrote a blog post that went viral called Running Agile. I think it was like Running Agile Scrum on Our Relationship, or something like that. Ooh. And she describes that they do this monthly process, her and her husband. And I did that for a while with my wife as well. And it's useful. I think we kind of internalized it over time. So this thing of like, it was useful to have a mark in the calendar that says once a month we're going to stop and we're going to like really reflect and talk over whatever issues have built up. But now I think we've been together long enough that we don't need to wait for a special meeting, you know, like you can just kind of do that. But that's, like I say, that's the person that knows me the most in the world. With everyone else, like, it actually is quite helpful to have some kind of explicit container or some kind of moment in the calendar where you're like, hey, let's talk, you know, like let's step out of what we're just doing habitually or instinctively, and like be a little bit more aware or a bit more conscious about what we're doing.
And we did bring that into our family after being at the Eco Village. So every Friday we would have Heart Circle at the Eco Village. So it's a real ceremony, got candles, you have a facilitator, and you go around the circle 3 times, kind of just checking in, then really saying what's alive for you. And the rule is that you're not allowed to premeditate what you're going to say. You're really, really listening and connecting in with the speaker. And then, you get the talking stick and you say what's alive for you. But it was adults only. My children are still little. They're only 4 and 7. Towards the end of our experience there, I'm like, well, I want to bring some of these practices into my life. So I kind of stepped away from Heart Circle in the community environment and brought it into the family. So we've probably brought it back to about monthly now, because weekly was definitely too much for the kids. I think it was too much for my partner as well. So we do that, and it's not necessarily like assessing each other, but it's just if there's something we want to bring up. And for my young kids, like my daughter, she really got into Pokemon when she was at a school near the eco village. All the kids were allowed to bring Pokemon cards into school. She used to trade them at recess. And then we came to this new school, and they're not anti-Pokemon, but they just don't let the kids bring anything into school from home to play with. So she brought that to our Friday heart circle, that she doesn't have anyone to play Pokemon with. So we were like, cool. So I set up a Pokemon club on a Saturday at a local park and went there, and not many people rocked up, like one or two, but we took extra cards. So there's always other kids there. So we could just let her play Pokemon and let her have that release. So it's just a beautiful invitation for people to share, whether or not they have something to share or not. And if you're happy for me to just keep rolling, I'll kind of let you know what I'm thinking about my kind of hybrid circles. It's really about bringing regularity in. So for instance, my family groups, my family are in the UK and then partly in New Zealand. So if we have a digital family group and you bring some regularity to that, it doesn't need to be that regular, like maybe every 3 or 6 months is kind of sufficient to bring the whole group together. But that then enables people, if they have something to share, there can actually be quite a lot of like worry or unnecessary rumination. How am I going to share this? Whereas if they know that, oh, in September, we've got that family get together, I know I'm going to have airtime, I'll share it then, if it's not urgent, So just having that regularity and having somebody to be the community instigator, to bring that together, I just think, if more of us do that, that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, it's assuming that people are actually heard, right? Like, because that in the good case, you have that regularity and you share the thing because you've got the spotlight or you got the opportunity, and then people hear you and they respect you and they respond in a useful way, and then next time I'm going to do it again. And the hard thing sometimes, especially when it's family, because family is spicy, is if that process doesn't go well, then of course it's like, well, you can have the dependable rhythm, but if you can't count on people hearing you or like responding in a constructive way, then people are going to be, they're going to withhold.
Have you toyed with many digital platforms other than Zoom to have like gatherings like that? Is there any apps that you love?
Not really, honestly. Like I've played with a bunch. I'm basically agnostic about the technology. I think it comes down to the facilitation, or like the kind of the clarity of the plan and the clarity of the invitation. Obviously, each tool that you use has different affordances or capabilities, and like there's things that you'll get in a video call that you won't get in a text, and vice versa. But if you have a like rough understanding, like a pretty shallow understanding of what the different platforms are good for, then I'm, like I say, pretty agnostic, and it's about like I've been in Discord channels or like Telegram channels that have a really dedicated community organizer who understands how to use the platform and like how to orchestrate people's attention and how to bring good questions and that sort of thing. And they go really well. And then I've been in other platforms, the same platform, but without that kind of facilitator posture, without that organizer, without the plan, and they tend to fizzle out and not really go anywhere. So and it's the same with the Zoom and all these other platforms. Like if you have like we've done a few things, because I'm far away from my family too, and like when we try and pile everyone into a Zoom call with no kind of structure, it's not really satisfying, it's like if we're hanging out at a barbecue or something, you can have 30 people on the lawn and they'll just naturally self-organize into conversation. But if you try and put 30 people onto a Zoom with no structure and no plan, and you're only really going to have one person speaking at a time, it's profoundly awkward. But if someone's got a plan, you know, like we're going to be in breakout groups, we're going to talk about what's happening with the kids right now, or what, some kind of like, basically, what game are we playing? If someone can tell you what game it is, and what are the basic rules, then it tends to go a lot better, I think, than just kind of like throwing everyone into a digital space and hoping it works out.
Yeah, I love that response. Thank you, Richard. One that I have enjoyed the feeling of is called spatial, but there's a couple of different spatials. Spatial chat is the one that I kind of like, because you're kind of this little bubble, so you can see whose face it is, but it's so much smaller than Zoom that you're not like critiquing their makeup or whatever, you know, you can't see them that well. But I love the autonomy that you can kind of shift yourself around. So if you do have a bigger group, then you can go off into one-to-ones very easily. And it just, yeah, it does have the feel of real life, much more than Zoom does, that you can't really even dictate where the faces are going to be on your screen. So I'm exploring.
Yeah, like spatial, there's another one called Gather Town. And that one is like a similar mechanic where you can move around, and you only can hear the people that you're nearby. But it's just styled in a sort of like old-fashioned 8-bit video graphics, kind of video game style. So for certain kind of applications, the kind of aesthetic of it is really cool. It's like for example, I've used it in, like, we might have a conference that's kind of serious, and then we have the socializing time afterwards, and we're going to go to Gather Town, and it sort of puts people in a different frame of mind, like out of Zoom and into this like video game reality that's a bit more like, I don't know, a bit more playful maybe.
Yeah, there's another one as well called Gather Round, which is a game one. Like, they've got a lot of games already embedded, or you can kind of put your own in with their format. I played with it a couple of times with very small groups, and then I invited my family group onto it, and it was a freaking nightmare. The tech totally failed. It was like a multi-generational family group, so my grandparents were not happy. So I was like, okay, let's not test it in this again. But it's, you know, it's all learning what's going to work. And I think it definitely has potential. I think it was quite early, that they hadn't launched very long before I played with it. So I think there was still some niggles, which I'm sure are probably ironed out by now.
The thing about the tech, like, yeah, I built a software company. I'm an engineer. Like, I'm proficient in the digital side of things, and even I'm like completely irritated whenever the software doesn't do the thing it's supposed to. And so I do have a lot of compassion for people, like if they're older or they just don't spend so much time with computers, and then you're trying to get them to do something, and they're like, it's very easy to feel stupid, or like, oh, I'm doing this wrong, or like, I find it quite unpleasant. And it's very rare to find software out there that's actually user-friendly and straightforward. Like, there's always some, you know, like you sit down in your thing and it's supposed to be all straightforward, but then some other thing jumps up on your screen and you don't know what it is, and it's like, oh, is there a virus, or a, you know, like there's this whole process of feeling lost and confused, which I find quite it's kind of like the opposite of the kind of feelings that we're trying to invoke in people when we do community organizing.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, so something that I wanted to talk with you was on the topic of intentional versus inclusivity. So what I've noticed on some of your tweets, you'll be in a new place like Berlin, and you'll be like, hey, we're meeting up here at this venue, see you there. Like, real open invitation. And kind of on the flip side, I'm kind of researching authentic relating events and intentional friendship and values-based friendship and all of this. So how do they kind of play together?
Yeah. Maybe if you think about it as a funnel, right? So like at the very, very top end of the funnel would be a promoted ad, where I'm like intentionally trying to reach out beyond my existing audience, and just like anyone, or like posters that I put up in a city or something like that, you know, like, anyone that sees this, please come. And then at the bottom of the funnel you have like yeah, the decision to get married, right? Like, super intentional, Most of us only choose one person at a time to get married to, and you're making this like intense commitment to each other. And there's a gradient of options all the way between those two ends of the funnel. When I put a message on Twitter saying, "Hey, I'm in Berlin, who wants to come hang out on Friday?" That is already quite filtered. Like the algorithm is doing a lot of filtering of like who has shared interests, who's kind of like, how do I say this? Like there's the people who will see the post, so that's already filtered, but then there's the people who will respond to it. That's much more filtered, because people have some internal sense of like, oh, am I really invited? It says everyone's welcome, but is it really me? I don't know. You know, there's that kind of process is going. And so like every time I've done this open invite process using Twitter or using a mailing list or something, that's like pretty open, I have honestly I've never had a negative experience. I've never had someone come and I'm like, oh, what a disappointment it was to meet you. You know, it's like sometimes they're a bit random and you're like, okay, we're probably not going to see each other again, but never disappointing. So that's good for like a meetup where the intention is about finding like-minded people maybe, or like just getting to know some new people. But then basically as you get into progressively higher stakes collaboration, that's not like let's have a picnic this afternoon, but it's like let's start a company, or like you want to be more selective. And again, that's been something that has been maybe a little countercultural in some of my community organizing, is being a bit more exclusive. I'm really comfortable with being exclusive and saying like, I'm going to do this community experiment, say we're going to have a retreat every 6 months, and these are the 15 people that are invited and no more. You're like that. I think it's completely appropriate to do when you're trying to achieve a specific thing, to be very specific about who you invite. And the more refined you are with that invitation, and the more limited you are, it kind of opens up possibilities that you can't do if random people are walking in and kind of like having to be brought back up to speed, or like they come actually with quite a different set of values and they don't want to do what you're doing. It's like, so I think there's that wide spectrum of options, and they have different uses.
So if you wanted 15 very specific people to come to a retreat, would you charge them? Can you charge them when you want them, when you want them there? Because like we were saying before, it's kind of mutually beneficial. You obviously, you have a goal in mind for the end of it. But you also don't want to be out of pocket when you are creating a beautiful experience for them. How is that? How do you?
There's one of the big bottlenecks, I think, in community organizing is the economics of being an organizer. That, like, I know a lot of people that can pull off a cool event and get people together, but I don't know many of them that can do it sustainably, because they do it either volunteering or severely underpaid, and then their energy gets they're in competition with all the other things that they could be doing with their time, and so they run out of puff and they stop doing it. So like for me, I'm better at this, like advising others, than I am taking the advice myself. But I think it's really important that community organizers get paid for what they're doing. Like it's extremely valuable. Like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I was at a more intensive kind of Twitter meetup. It's called Jess Camp, where Jess is an organizer, and it's called Jess Camp because she didn't have any other name for it. And she booked a hotel in the Black Forest, a 75-bed hotel for a week, and then filled it with Twitter people. And she always says, oh, I'm hardly doing anything, like it's so self-organized, everyone's helping in the kitchen, blah, blah, blah. It's not really worth much. And I'm like, how many people are there that have the confidence to say, I'm going to book a hotel for a whole week, and to hold that sort of uncertainty and anxiety for a whole year, while like in the future saying, I'm holding this, we're going to fill it up, it's going to be great. Like, to me, that is a very valuable service and deserves a salary, like it deserves to be paid like any other valuable service. So I guess I would say look a bit more closely into whatever resistance you have for getting paid. And And my experience has been like, if you can be clear about what kind of value people can expect, then they tend to be happy to pay.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to look up Jess Camp for next year.
That was really good. It was really,
when
really
when you were talking about putting posters up, it reminded me of Danny Wallace and the stuff that are you familiar with Danny Wallace? He's a British journalist. He wrote The Yes Man, which became a film with Jim Carrey. But he's done a lot of very random things. And I think his granddad did a lot. His granddad tried to start a cult, like in a different land. And he was just very inspired by that. So yeah, look him up because he's got some great stories.
I've been involved, like, for example, with art projects that are where we've got a bunch of artists from out of town that will come to a local place and kind of install themselves in public. And in those kind of settings, you're really dealing with random people. You're really dealing with just whoever is around and whoever shows up and walks into the space. And that's really interesting, to deal with people that have very little in common with each other, and to sort of like find, what are our shared values across this level of difference. But when it comes to like Twitter, for example, if I put a post on Twitter, it's so much more narrow than that. Like there's so much filtering that's already happened. So yeah. I'm just really feeling the gap in that spectrum. It's like it's really, really, really wide.
That is interesting, because I'm like, in some of the work that I do with clients, I'm kind of suggesting that they break away from the algorithm to like feel into who is coming to mind and then actually look them up rather than be dictated to by the algorithm. But in your experience in that context, it's like the algorithm is actually working for you, not against you. So I really like that my thoughts have been challenged on that. So thank you.
I mean, the flip of that though is like there are times where the personal invitation is exactly what you need, and it's like if you're trying to create something of something a little bit more precious, or something a little bit more refined or curated, then the personal invitation goes all the way. And I would never trust the algorithm or like a public invite to be able to deliver on that level of quality.
I had a really good tip from an older guy that I met this weekend called Marshall Drummond. And he said that I'm just about to get some business cards made up. And he said, don't get too many, like make them in demand. Don't give them out easily. And he said his favorite business card was a friend of his who is an artist. And the business card was just very plain, just the contact details. But before they gave one, they would do a little piece of art. So every card is unique. So that was a little tip that I got that I thought I'll share.
Nice.
Is there anything else that you really feel called to share with us, to share with your audience, to share with my audience while we're here today? Final words.
Maybe just one thing on the topic of Twitter. I think all of these social media platforms are really complicated from like an ethical perspective. And I've talked a bunch about how Twitter's great, and I also want to sort of hold the other end of the spectrum of like, I think that on the whole, most of these social media platforms are doing a bunch of harm to like our mental health and our democracies and so on. So I don't want to leave with a wholehearted, enthusiastic endorsement of like, yes, let's hang out on Twitter. But I do also want to say that for me personally, and for a bunch of my friends now, we have found really, really meaningful connection through the social networks. And if you set your mind to it, you can treat these platforms as a legitimate like community building space. And the art form for me is basically you use the digital layer to filter and find the interesting like-minded people, and then cross the threshold into the physical layer, like out of just the digital and into the physical. And that, like this Jess Camp that I described and other kind of meetups that we've been doing, it's so gratifying to kind of convert someone from a 64 pixel digital avatar to like a fully three-dimensional human being, and getting to know them and spending time together. Like that yeah, I just want to invite more people into playing that game of treating these online platforms as like a dating platform for making friends. And doing something, getting together and doing stuff together is like so much more gratifying than just having annoying arguments online or like sharing pictures of cats.
It's like your petri dish for play, and then bring them into the physical. Richard Bartlett, I want to thank you so much for being with me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've got loads to take away. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.